Good afternoon. Welcome to a webinar on dietary supplements, FSMA, and overlapping regulatory challenges hosted by EAS Consulting Group. EAS specializes in FDA regulatory solutions for some of the industry's most pressing challenges, offering 150 regulatory consultants strategically located around the globe who provide detailed assistance to FDA-regulated industries. Today's presenters are Senior Director for Dietary Supplement and Tobacco Services, Dr. Tara Lynn Couch, and Senior Director for Food Consulting Services, Alan Saylor. Dr. Tara Lynn Couch is a PhD analytical organic chemist with exceptional analytical abilities and over 25 years of diverse laboratory and regulatory experience. She is a sought-after expert on issues pertaining to quality control in pharmaceutical, dietary supplement, and tobacco manufacturing facilities, including the establishment of specifications and the development of well-organized, sophisticated laboratories. As Senior Director for EAS, Dr. Couch has assisted numerous companies with the development, improvement, and implementation of strong quality systems that are scientifically sound, efficient, practical, and compliant with all FDA regulations. Alan Saylor has spent more than 30 years as a food processing and regulatory expert, with half of the time serving in industry and the other half as a state and federal government employee. For 12 of those years, he served as Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and International Standards at the International Dairy Foods Association. His international experience includes representing the U.S. food processing industry at the Codex Committees on Food Additives, Food Labeling, Food Hygiene, and milk products. As a reminder, during the webinar, you may type any questions by typing them into the questions box, and we'll send the slide handouts at the conclusion of today's webinar. With that, I will say thank you for joining EAS, and I'll turn the presentation first over to Tara.
Thank you, Amy. I always feel old when you read all of that. So today we're going to be discussing dietary supplements and FSMA compliance. And we'll start with a little bit of a history. So of course, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, their job is to ensure the public health, the safety of the public health, and the efficiency and security of human and veterinary products, biological products, medical devices, again, by ensuring the safety of the foods. So as a historical perspective, the FDA was established in 1908 underneath the Pure Food and Drug Acts, the Wiley Act. And that really came about after a book that was published by Upton Sinclair in 1904 that revealed some very horrible conditions in the meatpacking industry. And at that time, the enforcement was by the Bureau of Chemistry. In 1938, we had the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, known as the FDA&C Act, a diethylene glycol poisoning that triggered the requirements for some sort of standards for safety of foods, drugs, and cosmetics, and a pre-approval process for all new drugs, making sure that they were safe. This was then enforced only by the FDA, and then there have been subsequent updates that have triggered various events, all of these reactive type of situations. There have been a number of major amendments to the FDA&C Act, and the two that we're going to specifically focus our attention on today is the 1994 Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, known as DSHEA, or sometimes referred to as DSHEA. And then in 2011, we had the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. So DSHEA, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994, broadened a historical definition of what a dietary supplement is. It also provided for structure function claims and health claims on those dietary supplements and authorized the FDA to promulgate good manufacturing practices, which they did 14 years later. So the definition of a dietary supplement is it's a product that is taken by mouth that contains a dietary ingredient which is intended to supplement the diet. Those dietary ingredients can include vitamins, minerals, herbs, or other botanicals, amino acids, and substances such as enzymes, organic tissues, glandulars, or metabolites, and any sort of extract or concentration of any of those items. They can be in the forms of tablet, capsules, soft gels, gel caps, liquids, or powders, even in the form of a bar, but they cannot represent the product as a conventional food or a sole item of a meal or diet. So dietary supplements are classified as foods by the FDA, and as such, those dietary ingredients that we just categories. They can be either GRAS, generally recognized as safe under the conditions of its intended use, and that's very important. Also, they could be grandfathered or what's often referred to as pre-DSHEA ingredients that were marketed in the United States as a dietary supplement before October 15th, 1994. And the magical thing about that date, of course, is when the regulation passed. Another option, if it's not pre-DSHEA or GRAS, then it could be a new dietary ingredient, and where there's another regulation, 21 CFR 190, that talks about the requirements for a new dietary ingredient. It's something akin to a GRAS notification, but it is more related to the formulation of the entire product. So the promulgation of the dietary supplement GMPs, those were issued in 2007. And what a GMP is good manufacturing practices. And it's a set of regulations and processes that all come together to control the manufacture, packaging, holding, and distribution of any type of product that's being delivered to the United States public. So it's really requires an entire quality system. And the purpose of this is to minimize or eliminate instances of contamination, mix-ups, and errors. And this in turn protects the public, which of course is the mandate of the FDA, as we saw previously. So there are a number of different GMP regulations. Here are some of them that are listed here. So of course, we're going to focus our attention on dietary supplements, but then also foods, as you'll see shortly. So these are dictated in the Code of Federal Regulations for Dietary Supplements. This is in the 21st chapter of the CFR 111, Current Good Manufacturing Practices in Manufacturing, Packaging, Labeling, or Holding Operations for Dietary Supplements. And this is what the CFR looks like in the handheld. In 111, there are subparts A through P that dictate all of these good manufacturing practices in painstaking detail. As a classification of foods, dietary supplement products must now also comply with the amendment to the FD&C Act, which came from in 2011 for the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, because again, we are a classification of foods. FSMA actually has 7 distinct rules. So there's the current good manufacturing practices for foods, which is based on Preventative Controls for human and animal foods, sometimes referred to as HARP C. We also have the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, or the FSVP rule. There's an intentional adulteration rule, a product safety rule, a sanitation transportation rule. There are standards for growing, harvesting, packaging, and holding produce for human consumption, and then there's also a voluntary accreditation third-party certification program. So the first 3 in particular are really relevant to the dietary supplement industry, and so we're going to discuss those. So the first of those is the 21st chapter of the CFR in 117, which are the current good manufacturing practices for foods. So that's called current good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventative controls for human foods. And this is what that particular pocket guide looks like. In 21 CFR 117, there are 7 parts to this regulation, A through G. Subpart A are the general provisions, which talks about the applicability of the regulation. It has definition of regulation and talks about some exemptions. So there's no specific requirements, but a lot of the definition around the regulation is provided in the A. In that section, 21 CFR 117.5 dictates that dietary supplement companies that are in compliance with 21 CFR 111, which again are the good manufacturing practices for dietary supplements, are exempt from subparts C and G of 117. So, and those 2 parts are the hazard analysis and risk-based preventative controls and supply chain program. So in these 2 subparts, C and G, in particular in subpart C, it talks about making sure that there's been an assessment of the hazards, both that are considered microbiological, chemical, or physical hazards. and you have to have preventative controls in place to make sure that the product that you would put out on the market is not adulterated or is misbranded. In Subpart G, it talks about supply chain requirements. In 21 CFR 111, which are the dietary supplement good manufacturing practices, those two portions of C and G are already covered, and that's the reason that we're exempt from those regulations. In 21 CFR 111.70, which is a part of Subpart E of 111, it has very specific requirements about specifications, and we have a number of different types of specifications that you have to have for a dietary supplement. Some of those being incoming raw materials or components, which encompasses all of the ingredients that will be used for the dietary supplement. So it will be dietary ingredients and any other sort of ingredients that are involved in the manufacturing process, in process materials during the actual manufacture and packaging of the process, and finished product specifications. And all of these have to hit 5 specific categories: identity, purity, strength, composition, and limits of contamination. So of course, identity makes sure that we have the material or product as it's supposed to be. Purity is a percentage of the material or product, but also underneath the World Health Organization, we discuss microbiological purity. And then we have strength for all the dietary ingredients that are provided on the label claim and any other potential label claims that might be made. And then we have composition, which is really a physical assessment of the material or finished product. So within those first 4, microbiological hazards and physical hazards are already covered. Then in the limits of potential contaminants, we're also going to be talking about some of the chemical contaminants in a dietary supplement. These will include things such as heavy metals, pesticides, and residual solvents, but of course there may be others depending on the nature of the material or the product. We also have to consider known intentional adulterants. Melamine is a good example of that. We had melamine poison back in 2009 and 10 in China first, and then it got into the pet food industry here in the United States. So that is a known intentional adulterant that was put in there to mimic protein content in infant formula and in chocolate and other types of protein that were used in pet food formulations. Allergens are certainly also a potential contaminant. So we particularly focus on wheat gluten, which is actually the gliadin protein. For gluten-free claims, the FDA defines that as less than 20 parts per million of that gliadin protein. But there are also a number of allergens. These are the top 8 food allergens shown here. So all of those requirements that were dictated in Subpart C of 117 in the food regulation are covered underneath Subpart E here for your specification. Dietary Supplement GMPs, it talks about supplier qualification. So in 111.75.2, supplier qualification requirements are necessary if you're going to rely on the certificate of analysis from your supplier. You can instead choose to test all of your every product, every incoming material, every time in accordance to that raw material specification that we just discussed. But if you want to rely on the certificate of analysis, then this is where 111.75.2 comes in. You can only do that if you've done some sort of confirmation testing of that certificate of analysis to make sure that that is accurate and precise. The supplier of that COA has a description of the limits and the actual test results and the tests being used on that COA. You also have to gather and maintain other documentation of the qualification, which we'll just discuss briefly in a moment, and periodically reconfirming that supplier COA. And all of this has to be reviewed and approved by the quality unit, which is collectively your quality control and quality assurance group in the dietary supplement world. Of note is that if you're using a foreign supplier for any of these incoming materials, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, FSVP program, will kick in. We're going to talk about that later, and Alan's going to elaborate on that even further at the end of this presentation. But you will have to make sure that your foreign supplier is complying with the 117 requirements and the Foreign Supplier Verification Program as applicable. Underneath that qualification program, there's usually multiple steps to that process. So the first of those is a documentation audit or a paper audit, which is an extensive questionnaire that asks questions about the quality system and the regulatory history of your particular supplier. They do not have to follow dietary supplement requirements in 111. They are considered foods, so they will have to comply with all the FSMA requirements as I indicated. Then that'll have to be followed up with an on-site supplier facility audit to make sure that everything that's written on paper is actually in practice. This is very critical in the dietary supplement world to do that. And then the confirmation testing of that certificate analysis. The FDA likes the rule of 3, so at least 3 in unique lots received of each material will be assessed to make sure that you have accurate and precise results. 3 is kind of a magic number mathematically as well, because that's the only way that you actually get a mean and standard deviation is with a minimum of 3 test results. Sometimes you'll have to go to more than 3 depending on the nature of the ingredient. If you know that you have something that's likely to contain microbial contamination such as botanicals, particularly organic botanicals, then you may actually have to do more than 3, and 5 is often used for that number. And then periodically you'll have to requalify this. So what that means is you'll have to update that questionnaire, send it back out every year, and have them provide any updates on that. Repeat that confirmation testing to make sure all of the specifications that are dictated, all of the criteria on that specification are still met. That's typically done every 10th lot or annually, whichever comes first. That gives you a minimum of 10% of a requalification process. And then depending on a risk assessment, you may have to do follow-up on site audits of the facility, and then that the frequency of those would be determined based on that risk assessment. So that's going back to the subparts of 21 CFR 117, they have the exemption section, and we're exempt now from C and G. So Subpart B of 21 CFR 117 are the current good manufacturing practices for foods. This chart shows a comparison. On the left side, we have 21 CFR 111 subparts, and then on the right side, we have Subpart B, which are the good manufacturing practices. And as you can see, all of these are covered underneath 21 CFR 111, all the requirements of Subpart Bs. And these are the different references from one section to another. So we are covering Subpart B underneath 111 as well, provided that you are compliant with 21 CFR 111 and all of those subparts. So that covers us for Subpart B of 21 CFR 117. Then moving on to Subpart D and E. Subpart D is modified requirements, and Subpart E is withdrawal of a qualified facility exemption. These are both very important because it talks about a qualified facility, and a qualified facility is exempt, just like the dietary supplement companies are, if they're compliant with 111. They're exempt from Subpart C and G. So what is a qualified facility? So a qualified facility is a small facility that has minimum dollar values or monetary values of their foods, and they're sold to direct consumers or restaurants or other types of immediate consumption facilities. This has to be done during the 3-year period preceding the application of this, and over half of the total annual monetary value of that food has to be processed in one of those qualified direct food consumers, restaurants, or retail food establishments. And they have to be located in the same state and within 275 miles of the manufacturing facility. In addition to that, they have to have an annual monetary value of less than $500,000, which is adjusted for inflation. So if you meet those criteria of being a qualified facility, you have to submit an attestation to the FDA dictating to them that, yes, I am a qualified facility, that you have done a hazard analysis of all of the foods for preventative controls, and you have some sort of monitoring activities in place to make sure that that's effective. You also have to demonstrate that you have complied or are complying with all state, local, county, or tribal type of requirements that may apply to you. And you can do this either through an electronic submission on the FDA FERL's website or through a snail mail submission process as well. So that covers Subpart D and E. So the last section we have here is Subpart F. So in Subpart F, underneath 117, it talks about records and the requirements for records. So in 117.305, it says we have to keep the records as original records or electronic records. They have to contain the actual values and observations that were made during those activities. They have to be accurate, indelible, and legible. They have to be created at the time of performance of the activity, and they have to have a detailed history of the work that was performed. In addition, there has to be some sort of identification of the facility, the identification of the product or the material, and a lot code if that applies, the date and time, if that's necessary, of the activity, signature and or date, signature and or initials of the person performing that activity. You don't have to comply with 21 CFR Part 11, electronic records and electronic signatures, unless there is another type of regulation that kicks in for your type of food product that you are making. In addition to those requirements of the records have to be retained for 2 years after the date that the food was prepared, or if you're a qualified facility, you'll need to keep that for 3 years to demonstrate, remember that you had to have 3 years preceding, so you would have to keep those records. And of course, you have to make those records available to the FDA upon request and inspection. In Subpart P of 21 CFR 111, which are the Dietary Supplement GMP requirements, we have similar requirements. So Subpart P is records and record keeping. In that section, it talks about the retention time for GMPs, and of course, all of those that we just talked about for making sure that it's an original record, making sure that it's initialed and dated, it's done at the time of performance. All of that is also dictated in Subpart P. And those records need to be kept for 1 year past the shelf life date of that dietary supplement. If there isn't a shelf life date that's used on the product, which is not a requirement for dietary supplements, then you would have to keep the product for 2 years past that distribution date. Bearing in mind that most dietary supplements carry a 2-year expiration, so most records are going to be kept for a minimum of 3 years, and probably longer than that. In the dietary supplement supplement companies, this is a serious adverse event requirement. Any documents related to a serious adverse event have to be kept for a total of 6 years. It's really impossible to splice out serious adverse event records from any other records that you would maintain at a dietary supplement facility. So I always recommend to all of my clients that you keep all of your records for 6 years to make sure that you cover yourself under the serious adverse event report. So that certainly is a longer period of time than what you would keep records for underneath 21 CFR 117 Subpart F. In addition, for dietary supplements, if you do have electronic records, which the vast majority of companies now do, you have to comply with 21 CFR Part 11, which is electronic records, electronic signatures. So keeping that as an original record, making sure they're maintained for the necessary period of time, which would be 6 years in this case, making sure that you know who did everything and when, requires an audit trail. All of that does come into play. So that's also a requirement underneath 111. So this is one of the reasons that we jokingly say GMPs actually don't stand for good manufacturing practices. They also stand for get more paper, get more people in the dietary supplement and also in the pharmaceutical world. So that covers all subparts of 21 CFR 117. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Alan, and he's going to give us some more details on what this Foreign Supplier Verification Program requires.
Thank you, Tara. This is Alan Saylor, and I want to thank everybody for participating today. These slides will also be posted on the EAS website. So as we go through the slides, if something was missed or we go a little too fast, you can see these slides. What I'm going to cover is another regulation that really has a huge impact on dietary supplement and dietary component, or sometimes I like to say dietary ingredients. When you import these dietary supplements or dietary components / ingredients, you are subjected, because they are food under the U.S. regulations, you are subject to another FSMA regulation called Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And a couple of highlights, and then we're going to go right into what does this mean for dietary supplement manufacturers outside of the U.S., dietary supplement manufacturers in the U.S., and the importers of either dietary supplements or dietary ingredients. A couple of highlights. The Foreign Supplier Verification Program, I'm going to use an acronym called FSVP, so I hope that is not confusing, but FSVP has two main components. And I'm going to go in general, not into the deep details, because I want to talk about dietary supplements and FSVP. But the first is that the importer of a dietary supplement or dietary component / ingredient must be have an office in the U.S., physically located in the U.S., and they must have some interest in the imported product, whether it's a supplement or an ingredient or component. That doesn't mean they have to touch it. They don't have to warehouse it. They don't have to see it. They have to have an interest in that product. And the second thing is that the FSVP requires certain evaluations of the hazards and the risks of the imported dietary supplement or dietary component ingredient. And that evaluation of risk and evaluation of the hazards and the risk associated with them must be done by a qualified individual. Now, in some cases, this doesn't apply to this. So this qualified individual can't just be somebody that is working part-time. They have to, by regulation, have knowledge of food safety and experience and or education. They also must have knowledge of the FSVP regulation. So as we talk about qualified individual, and that term is not well defined in our slides, I just wanted to do that verbally. So let us go to the next slide about very small importers. Now, very small importers are defined as importers that import less than $1 million of human food, and that can be dietary supplements or not dietary supplements, but they have to be human food on average over the past 3 years. Now, if you're beginning to import, obviously for the past 2 years, you had zero. And so this $1 million per year on a 3-year average starting this year and then back 2 years, you might be able to fall under this exemption. And this applies to dietary supplement importers or dietary supplement ingredient importers as well. And if this is the case, you are a very small importer, then regardless of how big the foreign manufacturer is that you're importing from, you can be exempt from most everything we're going to talk about related to the FSVP requirements. You don't have to have written programs. You don't need a qualified individual. And this makes it simple, but you have to have a letter and financial statements. You don't have to send them into FDA, but you have to have them available when an FDA investigator comes to the FSVP importer's office in the U.S. And they will expect either to see FSVP supporting documents or a letter. We call it sometimes an attestation letter, that with financial information that says you are under $1 million a year in imports of food over the past 3 years. So let's go to the next slide. And now we're going to go into the nitty-gritty of FSVP and dietary supplements. So there are some subtleties here. Try not to make them too confusing, but they can be. This is now about importing, and this is importing dietary supplements or dietary ingredients. So the first thing is that there are FSVP. I've heard sometimes people say, well, I'm importing dietary supplements, so nothing about FSV applies to me. Well, that is not true. Many of the FSVP requirements may not apply to a dietary supplement importer, but some still do. So let's find out what those some are. The importers of dietary supplements and dietary ingredients or components that are intended, they're brought in and then undergoing further processing in the U.S. are subject to very limited FSVP requirements because they are going to have to comply with the dietary supplement requirements that Tara covered so well just a little bit ago. And so if that is the case, where these imports are going to undergo further processing under the dietary supplement regulation, then all you have to do is make sure that the suppliers of the dietary supplements or ingredients, and these would be outside the U.S., obviously, comply with the dietary supplement GMPs, and you don't have to do the hazard analysis of the risk and the hazards associated with these imported dietary supplements or dietary ingredients. So let's go to the next slide. If you are a direct importer, in other words, you're importing these dietary supplements or dietary components or ingredients, and they're not going to get further processing. I'm not sure how that happens for a couple ingredients, but let's just say that's the case. Then you must, you're a direct importer, and there are options if your customer establishes a specification. So your dietary supplements, but your customer did, then, and these specifications meet 21 CFR 111, 73, and 75, which are the dietary supplement criteria. Then, if your customer establishes these specifications and you have confidence that they have done so, then the FSVP importer doesn't have to do anything. You don't have to have a qualified individual. You don't need to do a hazard analysis. You don't have to establish much in the way of records, except you have to have a written assurance from your customer that they, in fact, are complying and enforcing the specifications under the dietary supplements. So let's go to the next slide. Now, if the direct importer is not meeting the requirements, in other words, the customer that is using the dietary supplement that was imported by the FSVP importer is not providing assurances, then you still don't have to do the hazard analysis as the FSVP importer, but you then are required to provide assurances, in fact, that the supplier that provided these dietary supplements or dietary ingredients meets the same level of public health protection as found in the FSVP requirements. Now, the question is, does the dietary supplement regulation, if I was importing a dietary supplement from France, just making up a scenario, and they were complying with the U.S. dietary supplement regulations and the specifications, and you're importing from them, would that meet the same level of public health protection as found in the FSVP regulation? I think the answer is yes. Let's go to the next slide. The next scenario, and the last scenario, is if prior slide conditions fit you as a FSVP importer of dietary supplements or dietary ingredients or components, then you must follow all the FSVP requirements. You must have records from your supplier as defined not by dietary supplement regulations, but by FSVP regulations. The one nice thing, no hazard analysis. So if you look at the last three slides, all three conditions, the FSVP importer of dietary supplements or dietary components did not have to do the hazard analysis as required by FSVP. Okay, you then do have to get assurances from your supplier that they met the company from France, for instance, that makes the dietary supplement or dietary ingredient, that they in fact did meet the dietary supplement requirements. There's a very good reference here, and it's surprising. You wouldn't expect it to have any information on dietary supplement guidance, but FDA put something out in January 2018, which is an update, and it's called the Small Entity Compliance Guide, and I won't read the rest of this. In section 6 on page 17, it has a very good reference about FSVP and dietary supplements, and it covers very nicely. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see the table. The next two slides are actually tables, but this slide, the first one, summarizes in a very nice, condensed fashion what I just covered in the past three slides. And so the first slide, or the first row on this slide covers the first slide that I covered, where you have customers establish specifications. So I don't need to review that other than just to let you look at it, and you can reference it later if you want to look at our slides on the website. The second row down, the bottom row on this slide, covers the second slide, which I mentioned that your customers are not establishing specifications, and then you are. And finally, the last, let's go to the next slide, which is the third slide that I had covered. And this tells you that if none of the two conditions before were met, and this is a repeat of what I've said, then these conditions have to be met, and these are the FSVP requirements on the right side or the right column. So that's a bit of repetition. I don't want to spend a lot of time there. It was more as a tool to condense down everything we've covered so far. Let's go to the next slide. So in essence, if you are an importer of dietary supplement components or ingredients, and the dietary supplement manufacturer is complying with the dietary supplement GMPs, then you actually have met the food safety criteria of FSVP. And only limited additional requirements under FSVP have to be met. What are they? Let's go to the next slide. And on this slide, you will see there's two pieces of information, and I think this one may have a second click, Tara, that you might have to bring up, because I want to just cover, okay, so what are those minimum things from the prior slide? Well, if you look down, it says you must be identified as an FSVP importer on the U.S. Customs and Border Protection entry filings. Who files that information? Well, the FSVP importer usually is not the one filing all the trade paperwork with U.S. Customs. This is a private U.S. Customs agent. A private U.S. Customs agent needs to file the FSVP importer information if the condition is met. You, however, also demonstrated that the components are going to a U.S. dietary supplement manufacturer that is meeting the dietary supplement requirements that Tara covered earlier. You still need a qualified individual, and you still need to maintain records about the safety of the imported dietary ingredient. Let's go to the next slide. So, if your customer is required to establish specifications for dietary supplement components under the dietary supplement regulation and determine that the specifications have been met, then you, as the FSVP importer of the dietary supplement, must obtain written assurances. And this sounds similar. It's similar to what we led off early with. You have to have a written assurance, an attestation letter signed on company letterhead with a credible or responsible individual at a high level in the organization. Now, is any of that I just kind of alluded to or expanded on in the regulation? No, but I think it makes sense that that's what FDA is expecting. Okay, you then have to have the qualified individual. Remember what that qualified individual is. Somebody that has knowledge of food safety, training in food safety, knowledge of FSVP, and I would say, even though it is not actually in the FSP regulation, you need to know a little about the dietary supplement regulation as well. You have to have your U.S. Customs agent identify you as the importer upon entry, and you must comply with all the FSVP records requirements. Now, Tara had covered records requirements both for dietary supplements and for the preventive controls, another regulation. Well, this is the records requirements for FSVP. Let's go to the next slide. So, in a bit of a summation here, if you import dietary supplements in the U.S., either the customer establishes specifications for the imported dietary supplements or ingredients, or you have to. And in either case, you do not need to do the FSVP required hazard analysis, but you have to have a qualified individual. You have to evaluate your foreign supplier. You have to have a criteria for approving foreign suppliers. You must conduct periodically supplier verification activities. We recommend once a year, although that is not mandated. And you must maintain FSVP records. So to sum up, sometimes as we try and figure out which of these three types of criteria apply, and as an FSVP importer, what do we have to do? If you are importing dietary ingredients, this is only applicable to dietary ingredients, many times it can be easier to simply view them as a general food and not worry about the dietary supplement requirements and the if, the ands, the therefores, and all you have to, but you then, if you import a dietary ingredient and you determine that you want to categorize it as a food, then you must do all the FSVP, including the hazard analysis. So there's a good side in that you don't have to do a lot of attestations and checking with your foreign suppliers of dietary ingredients, but then you have to do all the FSVP. So it's a trade-off. I think I'm going to wrap up with that, and I do want to let my colleagues know that I had kind of queued up that I had to sign off at 2 o'clock, but that is not any longer a restriction. So with that, Amy and Tara, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And Alan, if you'll just run to, or Tara, if you'll run to the next slide, we should have contact info there. Perfect. So we do have a number of questions. Just a reminder, there is a questions box on your panel. If you have anything you would like to ask of our presenters, please send it in. And our first question is directed to Tara. And Tara, what is your or EAS's view as to the acceptability of including CBD in supplements that are not making disease claims?
CBD and the cannabis category is a whole nother can of worms. So the FDA has made it abundantly clear in a number of warning letters, and there actually was just a group of 15 of them that came out right around the holiday. I believe it was on November 25th, where they clearly state that dietary supplements, CBD is not a dietary ingredient that has been demonstrated to be GRAS or an NDI, and it was not pre-DSHEA. So therefore those products would all be considered adulterated. So the FDA's position is very clear that you cannot have a food or a dietary supplement that contains CBD. So that said, obviously the market is full of different food and dietary supplement products as well as cosmetic products that do contain CBD. So what the industry has been pushing for, and many trade organizations have been pushing for, is that the FDA would bring CBD underneath the requirement of 21 CFR 111 and treat it as a dietary supplement, and as such the ingredient itself would have to comply with one of those regulations we talked about, either the GRAS, the NDI, or pre-DSHEA. So we know it's not pre-DSHEA, so you'd have to do the GRAS or NDI. To date, the FDA has not accepted any of that and said they don't have safety information, so we're sort of in a conundrum right now about that. And so the industry has been pushing the Congress. So that's kind of where we are. It's unfortunate, but that's the position that we're in right now.
Great. I see a question that was sent a little further along, but I think it'd be a great one to put right up front. That is, could you please clarify if dietary supplement ingredients are a subset of dietary supplement components?
I'm sorry, can you read that one more time? Dietary ingredients are a subset of dietary components?
Yes, are dietary supplement ingredients a subset of dietary supplement components?
Yeah, so the FDA uses the term component, whereas in the industry itself, we tend to call things a dietary ingredient or some other component, collectively all raw materials. So anything that's in the formulation, so you will have a master formulation for your dietary supplement, anything that's listed on that list that isn't a packaging component would indeed be considered a component, and a dietary ingredient is going to be different because you could have a flow aid or something like that. So your mag stearate, for example, that wouldn't be a dietary ingredient, but that certainly is a component of the product.
Great, thank you. I also see a couple of questions regarding getting a copy of the handouts. And I mentioned early on that we're going to be sending those after the webinar today. So yes, those of you who did not get a copy, that's because we're sending them in just a little bit. So our next question is regarding 21 CFR 111.7. And the question is, does the WHO microbiological purity apply here when FDA defines purity differently? Isn't microbiology, like other contaminants such as elemental impurities and pesticides, covered under other specifications?
So you could apply differently. So the FDA's definition, they didn't define purity. In the preamble to the regulation, to 111, they do have a description of what they say, and that's that percentage of purity. But certainly, microbiology can be considered a contaminant, or it could be considered as a, an impurity. So you could really look at it either way. The important thing is that you have it on your specification. So it's important for you to have an SOP that describes what your specifications are and how you define those things. And you would have that in that SOP, and then on your specifications, you would do it accordingly. I always reference the World Health Organization because they do call it microbiological purity, and that's how a lot of the industry treats micro, and they put it underneath purity. But that doesn't mean you have no other purity requirements. You still will have other purity requirements depending on the nature of the raw material and the ingredient, the raw material and the finished product, or the in-process material, whatever the case may be for the specification. So if you choose to put it on the contaminants, that can also be fine, but you just have to make sure that you cover it one way or the other.
Okay, thank you. Alan, this one's directed to you. And the question is, when asking our manufacturers about FSMA regulations, most tell us they work through brokers. Does that mean that I, as a vendor retailer, am obligated to get this information from that broker?
That's an excellent question. And so if you're a U.S. manufacturer and you're obtaining components, or it could be dietary supplements, but let's just say that they are components, or as Tara mentioned, describing the ingredients, components are probably, for our intents, about the same in definition. So if you're getting something from a broker, what are your obligations? Well, believe it or not, you're not the importer, so FSVP does not apply. If you are simply selling them and not manufacturing, packaging, holding, and things like that, well, packaging, then the only requirement, if you're not doing the manufacturing, and Tara can correct me if I get this wrong, is the dietary supplement regulation may not apply. FSVP doesn't apply. However, the preventive controls would apply if you're holding. So the preventive controls regulation that Tara covered early in the presentation would apply. But that doesn't quite get to the crux of the answer. The answer is that technically you don't have any FSVP importer requirements. The broker may not. They may be the importer. They may not even be the importer. They may be getting it from the importer. So what do you want to do? The thing that I suggest is this. Okay, if by chance, and FDA is not strongly enforcing the FSVP requirements, and although they are doing a very strong effort on dietary supplements, but FSVP and dietary supplements, let's just say that all the things I told you are true, but are there bad things happening to people that don't follow them? It doesn't seem to be the case right now. The problem is, if there is a problem with a dietary ingredient or dietary supplement you got from a broker who may have imported it or may have gotten it from an FSVP importer, who pays the price? Who's got to do the recall? You do. So from a due diligence, not a government requirement standpoint, I strongly recommend that you ask your broker for documentation. If they are the importer, you want documentation that assures that the dietary ingredient or the dietary supplement met either the dietary supplement regulation or the preventive controls regulation. If it didn't, that's really important, and met at least the GMPs, if not the specifications as well. They may not want to give it to you, but I would press them and simply say that you need that information. their one concern you have to understand is that you're going to go around them. You're going to say, okay, I want to know where you got this from. They may be unlikely to tell you, but if you simply say, I want documentation that these specifications for dietary supplements have been met and that the dietary supplement or dietary ingredient or dietary component is safe, that isn't a requirement. I think that's just a smart way to operate a business today.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see. The next question is, does Canada follow the same regulations? Does a company that follows FSCR in Canada, which is in compliance with FSMA, do they have to follow the same procedures for selling dietary supplements in the US?
So let me take the kind of the second part of that. There's kind of two parts of that. So if a dietary supplement is going to be distributed in the US to the US consumer, then all products, no matter where they're coming from, have to comply with the dietary supplement regulations. So they would then have to comply with 21 CFR 111. So if it's being brought in as a dietary supplement, then those regulations are going to apply. On the FSMA side, I'll let Alan sort of answer that.
Thank you. I'm going to answer generally and then see if Amy, if you don't think I hit the mark, please follow up. Because Canada is recognized by FDA as having a food safety program that's equivalent to the U.S., the preventive control of foods other than dietary supplements, there is no additional work that needs to be done by a Canadian manufacturer to bring in a food. Now, a dietary supplement is a food, and I think Tara answered that part of it very well. So the question is FSVP. So let's put the dietary supplement regulation aside. Let's put the preventive control regulation aside. That's one of the FSMA regulations. Let's look at FSVP. So what are your FSVP requirements? Your FSVP requirements for bringing a product in from Canada are the same as if you brought it in from France or Australia or Kenya or something like that. At least that's a very general, there's some subtleties there, but let me stop there. And Amy, is there more to the question maybe that I missed?
I will I believe it was Jonathan who asked that question. Jonathan, if you have need for more clarity, just send us another question here in the questions box. I'll also mention, it wasn't specific to dietary supplements, but we did just have an article published by an EAS consultant on the similarities and differences for FSMA and Safe Foods for Canada. So you can access that on the EAS website. I believe it was in last month's, the November issue of our newsletter. If you are not already signed up for our newsletter, we invite you to do so, and you can do that on our website. Our next question is probably for Tara, and it is, we are a nutritional supplement manufacturer. We do not import ingredients. How often do we need to test ingredients from our suppliers?
So you'll have to create, as we talked about in 11170, talks about specifications for all of your raw materials. So that applies whether they're or whether they're domestic. So you will still have to create those specifications that hit those 5 categories of identity, purity, strength, composition, and limits of contaminants. So you'll still have to, have to create those specifications, and then you have to establish that those specifications are met. So in Subpart E, it talks about that in pretty decent detail. So if you're going to rely on the certificate of analysis, that's where that supplier qualification comes in. But even if you rely on the certificate of analysis, you will always have to do identity. So that's one test you can never rely on the C of A for. So anything that's coming into your building, regardless of where it's coming from, you always have to determine the identity of that. Now, depending on the material, or even if it was a product, depending on what that is, that can be quite simple or that could be very complicated. So for example, for a botanical, you'd have to identify that to the genus, species, and plant part. So that could be done in a number of different ways. Usually that requires multiple types of tests to do that. So it may be HPTLC along with some chromatographic analysis, for example, and as well as an appearance and visual. So there may be a number of things that have to be done to do that. If you want to use a reduced testing program and be able to rely on that certificate analysis, that's where that supplier qualification comes in. And you would have to do that confirmation testing, the first 3 or 5 lots, and then you would have to do requalification. You have to have those documents that we were talking about with the questionnaire go on site to the supplier, because somebody has to make sure that it's meeting all of those specifications. And if you're not doing it every time you receive it, you're relying on your supplier to do that, and the documentation of that is the C of A, so you have to confirm all of that. And of course, all of this would have to be dictated in an SOP.
Okay, great. Alan, the next question is for you. It is, as a dietary supplement manufacturer who also manufactures foods, are we required to create a food safety plan for our food items? And the reason for the question is there was some confusion about exemption and Subpart C for hazard analysis.
Okay, very good question. And that is not unusual that a manufacturer might produce a dietary supplement and also produce a food. And in fact, we have some manufacturers that produce pharma drugs and dietary supplements, or pharma drugs and foods. So the issue is the dietary supplement products must comply with the dietary supplement regulations as Tara outlined. The foods have to comply. If they're made in the U.S., they must comply with the preventive controls for human food, which requires hazard analysis, preventive controls, and things we didn't spend a lot of time going into here for general foods, the GMPs for foods. I know we have sometimes looked to see if we could take the dietary supplement regulations, which in some cases are much stricter and have more requirements than the FDA regulations for general foods. Could we just say, well, we're going to produce our dietary supplements and our foods all under the dietary supplement regulations? The answer is there are some things in the preventive controls for human foods that are for general foods that the dietary supplement regulation does not require. So therefore, you could try and extend the dietary supplement program into the general foods area, but you will be missing some things, and these things would be picked up on by FDA. I think if you tried to do the opposite, if you tried to take a general food program and extend it into your dietary supplements, there would be, I would suggest don't even think about that. But could you take a dietary supplement regulatory approach for your dietary supplements and for your general foods? Yes, but you still would be missing things. And we could talk another time about what those things are if somebody's interested. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just say that I come from a facility where we did both dietary supplements and pharmaceuticals, and I work with many companies, as Alan indicated, that do foods, dietary supplements together. It's very difficult practically to have 2 different types of GMP systems in place in one facility, and have people focused on have your personnel doing one thing one time and then something else another time. So as Alan indicated, you really need to pick what type of GMP system you're going to do and make sure you cover yourself in all situations. So if you wanted to comply with, if you have one facility and you're doing both, complying with 111, but making sure that the additional requirements in FSMA are also covered in those situations. Otherwise, a lot of people, what they will try to do is segregate and have 2 different buildings or 2 different facilities, and one facility run 111 and one facility run FSMA, and that can be the way to do that. If you try to do it, splice it up, I've never seen it practically work, because it's just very difficult for personnel to know what's followed when.
And I would encourage, is just a parting point on this. Tara covered a slide, and the slide was essentially a table. There was nothing else on the slide, and it had the dietary supplement GMPs in general on the left side, then it had narrative, and then on the right side, the preventive controls or the general food GMPs. And you can see they match pretty well, but just because they match, so that there is always something in dietary supplements, you can see a particular subpart. And on the right side, for the preventive controls, the general food GMPs, it doesn't mean that they are the same. For instance, if you're looking at master manufacturing records, dietary supplements require them, and in a way, general food GMPs require them. I can assure you the dietary supplement requirements are substantially more detailed. And in some cases, you will find the reverse. Not in many, but in a few, you will find the criteria for general foods, GMPs, to have slightly stricter requirements, but you can see that the similarities are the same. So to end the point, I think Tara said it well. If you're going to do one system, do the dietary supplement system, and then find out what other little things you have to add to meet the general food. Thank you.
Okay, so it's 2 o'clock. I wanted to get this one last question in, if possible. The question is, oops, we just got another one in, is regarding raw material suppliers. Is it true that the burden falls on the manufacturers?
Yes. So if we're talking about dietary supplement manufacturer, yes. So, I mean, honestly, in my opinion, this was the biggest omission of the 21 CFR 111, which was the exemption of raw material suppliers. Now, that has been remedied to a great deal with what we talked about all morning here on the FSMA requirements and FSVP in particular. But a lot of that, now there are much stricter requirements for food products, and that includes the ingredients. So most of the onus is, yes, on the manufacturer, because you have to establish those specifications and make sure that those specifications are correct. This is the foreign, quote, foreign thing that is coming into your facility. If you have a strong, good manufacturing practice system and you're complying with all of those subparts of the regulation of 111, most of your problems are going to be those incoming materials that you're receiving, and that's where you're going to spend a lot of your time dealing with those. So certainly the burden is on you, because you're the one that's determined that this is the material that's going to be used. I'm going to put it in my product, and I'm going to provide it to the U.S. consumer. So that ultimate responsibility is yours.